Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to this session. This is the 5th session for pediatric ophthalmology and squint today. And should we start with the speakers directly?
Yeah, you can start with the speakers.
So our first presentation is by Dr. Monica Samant, X-Files in Pediatric Ophthalmology. Now, just to introduce Dr. Monica, she's an eminent pediatric ophthalmologist, having completed her fellowship from LV Prasad Eye Institute, and also a research fellowship from University of Pennsylvania. Presently, she is a consultant and associated with Lakshmi Eye Institute.
Sorry to interrupt. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Shreya Shah, who is head of Drishti Netralaya in Dahod. Thank you, Shreya, madam, for agreeing to chair this session. And we have Dr. Abha Kanade, who is an eminent ophthalmologist in Pune. Thank you, Abha, madam.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving the opportunity.
I would also like to welcome Dr. Reshma. Reshma, are you here?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for participating, Reshma. Monica, you can start.
Yeah, my video is not starting. I don't know why.
Okay. Do you want us to go on to the next speaker then?
You could actually. I don't know why it's not starting. Just a minute. I'll just.
Sai can help with this.
Yeah.
Oh, that is that her problem is at her end, ma'am.
It's the video only is not starting. I've unmuted myself.
Okay.
We'll start with the next one, I think.
So our next speaker is Dr. Pooja Sasurkar, and she is also an eminent ophthalmologist from Kolhapur with 14 plus years of experience. And she's going to talk on sensory evaluation of strabismus.
Yeah. Just a minute, ma'am. I'm just sharing my presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Are you ready?
Just 2 minutes, ma'am.
Share the opening.
Mitali, are you ready with your presentation?
I think she is also asking.
Yeah, just a minute.
All the husbands are coming to help.
Can I give my presentation on ROP files?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Who is ready?
Can you see the screen?
No.
Who is ready?
Go ahead with Dr. Reshma.
Yeah, the last one. Yeah, I'm the last speaker actually in this session. So can I continue with mine, the ROP files?
Yes, ma'am, you can.
Yes.
The screen is shared by Dr. Mitali.
Can you hear me? Hello? May I audible?
Yes,
You are.
Go ahead.
Dr. Mitali, you are audible.
Oh, yeah. I'll start. Is it okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I will be presenting today the motor evaluation in strabismus. We will cover the motor examination under the two levels, ocular motility evaluation and muscle balance evaluation. Now coming to ocular motility evaluation, what is meant by the ocular motility? What are the position of gazes? How do we test ocular motility? What abnormalities we see? How do we document these abnormalities? Now, ductions are the uniocular movements and versions are the both eyes are moving together in the same direction. Whereas the versions are the both eyes are moving in opposite direction. Now coming to the position of gazes, there are two ways we can document the position of gazes. This is the midline central up and down. This is dextro up and down. This is the levo up and down. The other way of documentation is the primary position, secondary positions, and the tertiary gazes. Now, how do we test the ocular motility? We can test it voluntarily by using the fixation target with the help of the thumb and also by the doll's head maneuver. What abnormalities we see during the checking the ocular motility? Underactions can be checked on the horizontal muscles and the vertical muscles, and it can be checked both in the ductions and the versions. If there is absolutely no movement, we can grade it as a -5 underaction. If the globe reaches up to the midline, we can grade it as a -4. Just crosses the midline, it is a -3. If it's between the midline and the canthus, it is a -2. And when we can see just a little sclera, we can grade it as a -1 underaction. Now coming to overactions can be seen only in the vertical muscles and tested in versions, and it can be graded from +1 to +4. What other abnormalities we see during the ocular motility examinations are them? In the aberrant regeneration of the third nerve, we can see the retraction of the lid, whereas in the DRS, we can see the narrowing of the palpebral fissure and the widening of the palpebral fissure height. Now, how do we document this abnormality? We can document this abnormality using this line diagram, and we can grade it overaction as a +1 to +4 and underaction as a -1 to -4. Now we'll see how we are going to evaluate the muscle balance. What is normal and abnormal muscle balance? What are grades of muscle imbalance? How can you detect muscle imbalance? How do we document it? And how can you measure the degree of muscle imbalance? Now, what is normal muscle balance? Visual axis of both eyes meet at the object. Image of the object falls on the fovea. And what happens in the abnormal muscle balance? Visual axis of one eye becomes misaligned and image of the object does not fall on the fovea. Now coming to what are the grades of muscle imbalance? It is the latent deviation, intermittent deviation, and the manifest deviation. We can use the opaque occluder as well as the translucent occluder. Now coming to cover test. In cover test, we cover the one eye and then we'll see the movement in the other eye. If we can see there is a movement in the other eye, we can call this as a constant deviation or the manifest deviation. Now coming to uncover eye. In uncover test, we'll see the movement of the eye below the cover. Now in this video, we can see that the left eye is covered with the help of opaque occluder. And when we have removed the occluder, the eye moves from out to in, showing it's the exophoria. Alternate cover test is a combination of the cover and the uncover test. By doing the alternate cover test, we can diagnose the latent phoria, intermediate deviations, and the manifest squint. Now in this video, we can see just after covering, the eye moves from in to out, showing the esophoria. And here again, once we have removed the occluder, we can see that eye is moving from out to in, showing the exophoria. Now, what is the intermittent deviation? In intermittent deviation, sometimes the present shows the manifest deviation and sometimes it's exactly central. Intermittent deviations can be graded as a good control, fair control, and the poor control. In good control, we can see that the patient looks straight, and once we occlude the eye, patient's eyes start deviating. Now we are doing the cover uncover test, and once we'll take out the cover, just a minute, the video, yes, we can see the eye is moving from out to in. It's showing that's the good control. Without blinking, the eye has come from out to in. Now what do you mean by the fair control? In fair control, the patient is looking straight. Now we have, examiner has covered the one eye, and see the patient has deviated. There is a squinting, but still it's not coming. Now the patient has blinked and the eye is central. Then we can call this as a fair control. In poor control, the patient is already deviating without the occlusion. Now, constant squint we can classify into unilateral and the alternate. Unilateral means only one eye is continuously deviating, and alternating in which sometimes the right eye deviates, sometimes the left eye deviates. How can you measure the degree of muscle imbalance? We can measure the degree of muscle imbalance with the help of prism bar and the loose prisms. We can use the different tests to measure the degree of muscle imbalance, such as the Hirschberg test, Krimsky test. In Krimsky test, we will hold the prism apex toward the deviation in front of the deviated eye. Whereas in modified Krimsky test, we'll hold the prism in front of the normal eye. Now coming to the prism cover test. Prism cover test can be applied if the vision in the deviating eye is good or more than the 624 and the extraocular motility is good, then we can do the prism cover test. In prism cover test, always the apex of the prism goes towards the deviation. Means if it is exotropia, apex will go to the out, and if it is the esotropia, the apex will go in. Now we will do the we will hold the prism in front of the eye and we'll do the cover and cover test to measure the angle. We'll move up, increasing the prisms and until the neutralizing movement of the eye will achieve. If we want to add another horizontal prism, we cannot add in front of the same eye. We have to keep that prism in front of the another eye. If horizontal deviation is associated with the vertical deviation, then we can add the horizontal and the vertical oriented prism together. How do we document it? Exophoria can be documented as X, esophoria as a E. Intermittent exotropia and esotropia can be like X, E and in bracket T. Constant esotropia as a ET and the constant exotropia as a XT. Now, how we are going to document is abnormal muscle balance. We can document it by using this line diagram showing the 9-gaze photograph. This we can read as a 20 prism of intermittent exotropia in the primary gaze, whereas this is a 40 prism of intermittent exotropia in the up gaze. This is a 20 prism of intermittent exotropia in the dextro gaze, and this is the same as the levo version and the down gaze. Thank you.
So next speaker is ready. By the time Dr.
Dr.
Monica,
Monica ready?
so by the time next speaker gets ready, I'll just add to Dr. Monica. When we have a very larger degree of strabismus and we are not able to put full prism in front of one eye, we can collect two prism, apex to apex, but in that case, then the addition of both prism should not be counted. We have to apply Prentice rules. C square is equal to square root of A square plus B square. So that works. It's not exactly addition. And when we do modified Krimsky test, especially for esotropia, when you are putting prism on good eye, then again you can ask them to look at torch and again do PBCT. So
Just
that
one line.
a good thing. Okay, anybody is ready? Dr.
Yes.
Abha, you want to speak something?
Yeah, just I wanted to say the squint examination of the squint patient starts the way the patient enters in your room. So just note down if the patient has any abnormal head posture, note it down. It may or may not be significant because what happens, our other examinations, they are in the primary position. So sometimes the patient may not adopt and he becomes conscious. So he may not adopt the abnormal head posture. In that case, you can ask him to read the Snellen's chart binocularly and he may adopt the abnormal head posture. So I just wanted to stress that point that as soon as the patient enters in your room, abnormal head posture.
Otherwise, share screen, the entire screen will be shared.
Dr. Monica is ready now, I think.
Yeah. Just a minute.
Dr. Riti, shall we move to?
Is Dr. Monica ready?
Yeah, I am. I'm just sharing the screen.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Open कर तुझे हे minimize कर
Dr. Pooja, keep yourself ready after Dr. Monica.
Just a minute. I'm sharing the screen now.
Okay.
Can you all see now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. So good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I want to thank all the BOA faculty and especially Dr. Prachi for making me an active participant in this meet today. So my presentation is a little different. It's not strabismus, it's pediatric ophthalmology, different cases that we will run through. So case 1.
You can click on enable editing and then you'll be able to do slideshow, I think. Yes.
Let me see. Yeah. So the first visit is it's an 11-year-old male who came to a general OPD in July 2020, complaining of pain and redness in the right eye since 2 days. He was diagnosed elsewhere as acute anterior uveitis and was on treatment with steroids and cycloplegics. So when the examination was done, the positive findings were that he had ciliary congestion and the anterior chamber showed 3+ cells. Now the diagnosis remained the same at that stage, Only thing that they revised and gave him a little stronger topical steroid and increased the frequency of the steroid. Subsequent visits were again there in the OPD. After 1 week, the patient had responded to the treatment, and so the steroids were tapered. Now, the same patient had a second episode in September. He was again given the same treatment, and again he was okay in another 3 weeks. The patient then comes to us in third episode in November. Now, this point in time, he was referred to a pediatric OPD for the same complaint of pain and redness. So when he visited our OPD, we got a detailed history regarding any joint pain, swelling, if he had any fever, cough, or he had any trauma. So everything was negative. And what we found was he had ciliary congestion, posterior synechia, and cells were 4+. So if you can see in the picture, ciliary congestion and the posterior synechia. So now the question was, there are two questions that come: acute anterior uveitis in children, how common is it? And when do you say it is dangerous? So pediatric uveitis is actually a rare disease, the incidence of which is around 4.3 per lakh. And 50 to 80% of the cases of uveitis are anterior uveitis, of which 70 to 90% cases are derived from non-infectious causes. So the common causes are JIA, that is juvenile idiopathic arthritis, of which 80% uveitis in JIA is anterior uveitis with chronic course. Usually these patients have white eye. Now, in JIA also, you have rare presentations which can come with redness, pain, decreased vision, which is usually seen in children who have arthritis, idiopathic arthritis, but have HLA-B27 positive in them. Second common cause is sarcoidosis. This is a multisystem inflammatory disease, and usually 30 to 60% have eyes involved with non-granulomatous anterior uveitis. So we investigated this child for routine investigations. We did a tuberculosis test, Montooks, which was negative. And to our surprise, even the CRP was normal. We sent the patient for pediatric opinion for immunology workup. And he had HLA-B27 positive, which pointed towards the arthritis. In fact, his ACE levels were 95.3. So was very high inflammatory markers, which is pointing towards sarcoidosis, because he did have a lymphadenopathy later, but did not have COX. So they had done an HRCT and had derived. So this is an extremely rare possibility of having arthritis with sarcoidosis in an 11-year-old. So they started him on systemic treatment by the pediatrician. We started him on local treatment, and patient responded well. And now for the last 3 months now, he has no repeat episodes in the eye. So what are a few takeaway things from this case? Anterior uveitis in children is rare, but it's seen. A detailed history is important. If the attacks are frequent, that is like twice in a month, or not responding to treatment like it was with us the first time when he came, need systemic evaluation. Third pearl, patient may not have systemic signs, joint swelling, or may not have any arthritic signs. Only ocular signs may be present, even for an inflammatory clause like sarcoidosis too. Pearl 4, always keep these patients under your follow-up for seeing what are the recurrences in them, treating them, and especially for IOP because they can have secondary glaucomas. Now going on to case 2. So a child who is 2-year-old male came to the OPD in July 2016. He had come with high myopia, microspherophakia, and megalocornea diagnosed elsewhere, and was advised both eyes clear lens extraction. When we examined him, he has -23 on retinoscopy, and he had 3/48 vision. The patient was advised examination under GA. So what we saw was that the pupil was phakic in the pupillary area, though he had phacodonesis, but no subluxations. He was myopic, and the axial length was 24.98 millimeters in the right eye and 24.84 in the left eye. We investigated him. To our surprise, he had urine homocysteine positive, whereas his serum homocysteine was normal. He did not have any heart abnormalities. So we gave him glasses, which he was comfortable with, and had a follow-up visit with the glass. After 3 months, when the child was 2.5 years old, what we saw in the EUA, again when we did that, was that this patient had phacodonesis with mild subluxation. Now this subluxation was infranasal, and it was covered by the lid. The pupillary area was still phakic. We had a retinal evaluation done for him, and we were discussing whether we should have a lens extraction pars plana approach or we wait because his pupillary area was still faking. The patient was advised to continue glasses. We talked with the parents, told them the various possibilities of it, and would think after 6 months whether we really need to go for a surgery or not, depending on the pupil area and the lens status that time. After 6 months, when the child was 3 years old, he comes to us and he had a lens. He had already had a lens drop, and he was in the left eye 6/24 with +8, whereas his right eye was still -22 with counting fingers 1 meter. So now we again thought we would still wait, give patching for his left eye, for the right eye with the high myo, and see what happens next. The patient comes after 3 months, and now to our surprise, his right eye was following exactly the path of the left eye. The subluxation was same like the left eye, going in the same direction. So we decided we'll wait and watch. At the age of 4 years, this child is now both eyes aphakic, has +6 diopters of hyperopia, and was 618 N6. By 6 years, he's 69 N6 with +4, still aphakic, has myopia with lattice degeneration because he's more cooperative now for examinations. And this is how he looks now. So if you can see in the above picture, you can see the aura, you can see a few lattices, and you can see both those lenses which are really very nicely sitting in the vitreous with no symptoms at all. And the child is happy, the mother is happy because from -20 to thick glasses, it's like now +4 very thin ones. So if the takeaway was, if a child is too young and if the pupillary area is faking, one should wait and watch. But at the same time, a long-term follow-up is needed for life in such cases because you need to diagnose early secondary complications. See, as lens is an immunoprivileged organ, the only time you would like to remove it would be if it's causing any inflammatory signs or it's causing any other signs like increased IOP or glaucoma, or his lattice degeneration worsens and he gets an RD. So you keep him at least till 18 years with us and then later in the adult OPD. Case number 3. So this was a 3-year-old female who presented with decreased vision in the left eye. The right eye was status post repair for penetrating trauma 1 month ago elsewhere. So this is actually a little sad. She had come to visit her parents for a holiday, and in that time she had right eye trauma, and they had got it operated. They were doing repeated follow-ups, but somehow she was not able to see. That is what her parents came to us telling after a month. Now the right side picture shows you the left eye picture, which is media hazy with an exudative RD. On examination, the right eye was no PL, but the left eye was close to face, thick membrane in the AC, and the posterior segment was hazy. The B scan showed choroidal thickening, and the left eye was a sympathetic ophthalmia, which had presented after a month. So treatment was started on systemic and local immunosuppressions, and very
Monica,
strong.
1
Like we
minute
had,
more.
yeah.
1 minute more.
Yeah, sure. So we had at 1 month and at 6 months. Gradually, we actually followed her for after 6 months, she was lost to follow up from visit one. From visit 1, after 1 year, again, she had a recurrence. Then after 11 months, we retreated her. The new issue was cataract. We operated her under severe, heavy systemic steroids and immunosuppression. Now she was 612 N6, but gradually she has developed glaucoma. She's right now on topical steroids and topical anti-glaucomas, with the current vision being 624. So a few takeaways: always see the other eye. Sympathetic ophthalmia is not rare as it seems. Close follow-up with multidisciplinary approach is essential because we were constantly in touch with the pediatric immunologist and repeated tests on her. And extensive and timely counseling of patients in regards to treatment, side effects, and nature of the disease is pertinent. Very important. Case 4, the last one I'm telling. So first visit, a 8-year-old child came to the pediatric OPD. Complaints of redness on temporal side of the left eye since 1 day. They attributed it to a small drop of oil in the eye, gone 8 days back. And he was already presenting with ocular DH, which he was putting for 4 times. There was no history of pain, stickiness, discharge, fever, sore throat, trauma, nothing. So on examination, there was temporal congestion. We started him on antibiotic steroid combination and asked him to follow up. After 1 week, there was improvement in the temporal congestion. But if you observe this picture right now, in spite of that treatment, that patient had developed an infero nasal congestion.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you will have to summarize this case because you short your time.
So this is, so family had COVID history. Parents tested negative 1 month back. So basically review of opthal, if you see, conjunctivitis is common. This patient was RT-PCR positive in spite of the family being positive a month back and then negative again. So patient was started on systemic treatment and he responded very well. His younger brother later came on to have the similar complaints. So he also was treated, again, RT-PCR positive and treated systemically and improved. So basically, COVID is not only just, you have to look at it whether it's infectious or immune mediated, and we'll go with systemic treatment and not just with local treatment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Monica, for the lovely presentation. We'll move ahead.
Call upon Dr. Pooja Sasurkar to start her presentation on sensory evaluation of strabismus.
See the next one, that's important for you.
Dr. Pooja, are you ready?
Yes, she started her screen share.
Yes.
Perfect.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, ma'am.
Yeah, actually in Kolhapur, it's heavily raining, so my connection is getting off. So let's see how it works. Today's my topic is sensory evaluation of strabismus. Basically, I want to introduce into the 4 categories like normal binocular vision. As we all know, normal binocular vision is like binocular sensitivity and binocular vision are absent at birth. But horizontal binocular connections develop at the age of 3 to 6 months of the age. And even the stereopsis develops in 3 to 5 months of the postnatal age. So what is a binocular singular vision? Foveal fixation so that each eye contribute to a common single perception of the object of regard. So binocular singular vision has been graded into 4, that is a
She lost connectivity again.
Yes.
I think you keep her to the end, towards the end. Otherwise, you guys will not have any time for questions. Ashini.
Okay, ma'am. Dr. Pooja, can you hear us? No, I think she cannot.
She can hear actually. Mr. Sai can help. You can stop sharing.
Mr. Sai, please stop her screen share. Pooja, please stop your screen share.
No, I think she's lost connectivity.
Somebody has phone. Yes.
So I
Now
guess
keep her in the end and
yes,
go with the next one.
So I call upon Dr. Shruti Mittal to talk about paralytic versus restrictive strabismus.
My connection is yeah.
So Dr. Shruti Mittal has done her pediatric ophthalmology fellowship from Shankar Netralaya, where she also worked as a consultant for over 5 years. She expertises in pediatric ophthalmology, squint neuro-ophthalmology, nystagmus surgeries, etc. I now call upon Dr. Shruti to do her presentation.
Very good evening to all of you. Am I audible and is my screen visible?
Yes, Shruti,
you're audible and the screen is also visible.
Okay. So I shall start. I'm Dr. Shruti. I'll be talking about paralytic versus restrictive strabismus. So when do you suspect a paralytic or a restrictive strabismus? We'll see with a few examples here. This was a 53-year-old lady who presented to us with sudden onset of squint and double vision and inability to move the right eye laterally. On a detailed evaluation, she was found to have right esopropia, which worsened in right gaze, and there was an associated limitation of abduction in the right eye. Similarly, this was a 60-year-old female who presented to us with the left eye appearing larger than the right eye and intermittent diplopia. And on detailed evaluation, she was found to have a lid retraction in the left eye, a right hypertropia, which worsened in upgaze, and a limitation of elevation in the left eye. So what both these cases have in common is an concomitant strabismus and limited duction in one of the eyes. So whenever there is a limited duction, it is either a paralytic etiology or a restrictive etiology or a combination of the two. So paralysis basically indicates a weak muscle action or a complete loss of muscle function. And the main etiologies can be classified as cranial nerve palsies, primary muscle disease, or mechanical disadvantage of muscle pull, like in a stretch scar. On the other hand, restrictive strabismus is due to 2 general mechanisms, either due to a mechanical teether on the eye movements or a misdirected muscle force that works against the normal agonist muscle. So these are some of the causes of restrictive strabismus. So both these etiologies would present either with a strabismus, abnormal head posture, motility limitation, or a double vision. So while examining these cases, a few things that we need to keep in mind are measure the squint in all gazes. Most of them would have concomitants. The deviation should be measured with either eye fixing, that is primary and secondary deviation. And the secondary deviation, if larger than the primary deviation, would indicate a paretic etiology. If there is a vertical deviation, do a Parkes 3-step test. And if there is a particular pattern, it indicates the presence of a vertical or a oblique muscle palsy. Look for an abnormal head posture. Most of these patients would have one to avoid diplopia. And if there is a facial asymmetry, it indicates the presence of a long-standing palsy, like in case of congenital superior oblique palsy. Look for associated signs. A presence of anisocoria could indicate the presence of third nerve palsy. Ptosis could again indicate a third nerve palsy or presence of myasthenia. Any signs of ocular or orbital trauma would indicate possible orbital fracture. Weakness would indicate there is a presence of myasthenia. So there are various tests to differentiate whether it's a paralysis or a restriction. We'll see some of these tests one by one. So saccades are the fast eye movements, and recti muscles are mainly response for the saccadic movements. So when we are testing for saccades, we are testing for rectus muscle function. So here in this video, we can see that in the left eye, the abduction saccade is definitely slower than the adduction saccade. So we look for the briskness of the saccades and always compare the agonist and the antagonist muscle, as well as compare it with the other eye. The advantage of this test is that it can be done easily without touching the patient, and it is a bedside test and therefore can be easily used in children. In paralysis, characteristically, there is a slowed saccadic velocity or a floating saccade, and in restriction, there is an abrupt stop, also known as dog on a leash phenomenon. Coming to forced duction test, here we look for restriction to passive duction. You anesthetize the eye with topical proparacaine drops and hold it at the limbus with the help of 2 tooth forceps and try to passively rotate the eye in different directions and look for any resistance to movement. Important thing to remember is that if we are looking for recti, the globe has to be proptosed. And if we are looking for the obliques, then we have to retropulse the globe. Please note that positive FDT does not rule out the presence of a coexisting palsy. So here is a video which shows the FDT for obliques. We can see how the globe is being retropulsed. And if we are looking for the superior oblique, supposedly, the eye is rotated superonasally and then rotated superotemporally while feeling for a bump or lump posteriorly, which would indicate a taut or a tight superior oblique muscle. Coming to the force generation test, here we measure the active muscle force after anesthetizing the eye with topical proparacaine. We feel for the muscle pull against the forceps. So always compare it with the antagonist again and with the other eye, and a weak pull or a tug indicates paresis. IOP changes are often seen in a restrictive etiology. IOP increases when the eye tends to forcibly move against the restriction. This is characteristically seen in cases of thyroid eye disease. Palpebral fissure changes in restriction are in the form of globe retraction and narrowing when the eye moves away from the restriction, whereas in paralysis, there is a relative proptosis and widening. Aberrant regeneration indicates a paralytic etiology. Like in this case, we can see there is lid retraction in down gaze, which would indicate a traumatic third nerve palsy. Hess chart in paralysis and restriction would show characteristic changes. A smaller field is usually of the affected eye, and the greatest inward displacement indicates the primarily underacting muscle. Here we can see a right lateral rectus palsy. And in this case, we can see that the left eye field is compressed both superiorly and inferiorly. Such compressed fields usually indicate a mechanical or a restrictive cause. In this case, it was a left orbital floor fracture with inferior rectus entrapment. So here we can summarize the various findings in different tests in restrictive and paralytic strabismus. Important thing to remember is that they are not mutually exclusive and both the etiologies can coexist in the same patient. Principles of management I would like to highlight is we usually wait and watch in these cases and not immediately jump to surgery. Treat the systemic associations, and if surgery is planned, it is mainly for an abnormal head posture or to correct the diplopia. The patient should have realistic expectation and has to be counseled well and should be motivated enough. So why do we need
1 minute more?
Yeah, this is my last slide. So why do we need to differentiate? In the words of Dr. Kenneth Wright, management begins with the understanding of cause. So if we are looking at restriction, we release the restriction during surgery. And if it's a paralysis, we strengthen the muscle by a recess resect procedure or by transposition. I would like to thank Dr. Himalini Samant for giving me this opportunity and the BOA organizing committee. And thank you all for a patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Shruti, for the lovely presentation.
I now call upon Dr. Aloka Hedao to speak on infantile esotropia. Just to introduce Dr. Aloka, she is an eminent pediatric ophthalmologist who also specializes with special eye needs for special children, along with pediatric ophthalmology and adult strabismus.
Thank you for this opportunity, BOA and MOS and Dr. Prachi. A small prayer for all struggling all over our country with COVID and now with cyclones. So hope that a lot of us who have lost loved ones get some peace here. I think the slide is running. So first of all, this is for postgraduates where you need to know what is pseudoesotropia. So epicanthal folds, short interpupillary distance, and negative angle kappa. And the way you can differentiate it is by just lifting off the skin fold, and you can differentiate between a true and a pseudoesotropia. The characteristics of essential infantile esotropia, they present by 6 months of age. There is usually no neurological deficit, and most of these children do not have hereditary parameters or genetic markers which are passing on through the family. What is the area of origin? Area of origin, is it nuclear? Because these are children who have esotronus but good abduction, so less likely to be nuclear. Is it cortical? If it is cortical, then it has to have some motor involvement. So usually the area of origin in these patients is subcortical but pre-nuclear in origin. Now, what do we mean? Now, this is how when the eye object falls on the nasal hemiretina, we have crossing over which happens here at the chiasma, and it goes into the cortical area. But there is also another pathway which goes through the subcortical nuclei, including the cerebellar nucleus and the vestibular nucleus, and then it goes to the parapontine reticular formation and oculomotor nuclei and to the extraocular muscles. And this causes esotonus to happen. Now, in normal babies, we see that by 3rd month of age, this subcortical pathway is not there. This pathway is there only in some primates who have laterally placed eyes. But this pathway continues in infantile esotropia, and that is known for the cause for esotonus as well as optokinetic asymmetry. Now let us see what happens. This is the routine optokinetic drum that we use. So as the patient starts the pursuit movements, we see that there are these corrective saccades which happen, and these are typical of optokinetic. This is typically a sign of health called optokinetic nystagmus. Now, in infantile esotropia, even if you correct the patient, nasally directed saccades will continue, but temporally directed optokinetic motion will not elicit any optokinetic nystagmus, and this is typical asymmetry in infantile esotropia. Now, as Dr. mentioned earlier, we have a Wieth-Muller circle, and if any of the objects they are following in this circle, there is motor fusion, and there is sensory fusion, which is higher level of fusion fusion, that is binocularity and stereo acuity. But in infantile esotropia, this does not happen because there is no corresponding points, and therefore there is suppression and amblyopia. Their associations usually are DVD, latent nystagmus, angle should be large angle, low level of hypermetropia, amblyopia, cross fixation, and many cases have primary inferior oblique overaction also. Now, this is a typical case of latent nystagmus, as well all the other features of uncorrected infantile esotropia seen in an elder child, where you see DVD, you see primary inferior oblique overaction, and gross amblyopia too. Visual processing, we receive information through our senses, we organize this information and we use it to interact with the environment. So not only viewing, but decluttering of toys, selecting your shirt, or selecting socks from a drawer, reading a book, writing from a presentation, all this requires skills of visual processing, and these are essentially affected in children with infantile esotropias. What are the threats? The threat is amblyopia, poor stereo acuity, poor binocular vision processing, and surgical undercorrections and overcorrections. How will you categorize? Now, when you want to understand success rate, duration of surgery. So when you should be operating, is the patient amblyopic? Is there manifest nystagmus? Is there DVD? And what are the chances of motor fusion? So the routine the care should be first you have to correct amblyopia, surgical management, and plus or minus Botox. So surgery for infantile esotropia, what are your outcome parameters? What is the postoperative angle of strabismus, immediate as well as long-term stability? Are you going to regain binocularity? And how many operations are you going to require to get this goal? Now, we have seen that stable long-term alignment in patients with infantile esotropia depends on these factors. If you have better stereo acuity post-op, if you have less nasal OKN bias, and you have less MVP asymmetry, that is what I was explaining earlier. So earlier surgery done, the nasal versus temporal asymmetry bias that we see on optokinetic nystagmus is lesser. Now, timing of the surgery for infantile esotropia is one of the biggest debates in our societies here, and there are lots of studies done. One of the major studies done by Dr. Wong and group found out that large constant esotropia, if operated early, less than 10 months of age, gives very good outcomes. So they were proponents of early surgery. Now, why early surgery has been a debate? Because some people still feel that early esotropias can be self-resolving. Now, in this big study, which was done by the PEDIC group, they found that those who had intermittent esotropia, which were variable angle and very small angle, less than 40 or less than 30 prism diopters, are the only ones which are more likely to resolve. But all patients who have squinting which persists beyond 3 months of age, constant squinting, larger squinting, these are less likely to resolve and they should be operated. So all these studies, they found that early surgery, the asymmetry of OKN was also better. This is the important slide where clinical profile of infants will benefit the best from early surgery. And here you see that the patient persistent esotropia from 10 weeks to 6 months, constant esotropia of more than 40 prism diopters on 2 separate examinations, small hypermetropia, and absence of all these features. These are the ones who will benefit most from early surgery. Now, Helveston and group found out that 3 to 6 months of surgical time would be very good. They have very good surgical alignment, and these are the patients who did very well. They gained very good stereo acuity. There was Ellis group, which is the European group where they studied early versus late infantile study. And as we all know, European societies, many a times they opt for later surgeries. And here they compared early surgery at around 20 months and late surgery around 40 months. That's almost around 5 months of age, where they found that early surgery did gain good binocularity, stereo acuity, and they had good psychomotor development. But in later surgery, the angle of deviation measurement was much more precise, and therefore they could have less undercorrections and overcorrections, and also DVDs or the secondary motility disorders could also be elicited much better and handled much better. There is another study which says that till you do the surgery, at least start doing alternate eye occlusion, because this prevents or this decreases motion processing abnormalities which are seen in infantile esotropia. Now, which surgery do you select from? Bilateral recession, unilateral recess resect, 3-muscle, pattern surgery, or do you try Botox before or as an adjuvant? Now, this study, they had a large profile of 576 patients, and they divided the surgeries, of course, according to the angle of deviation. And they found that there was really not much of a difference between various surgeries that they did. Only here they found that there was less asymmetry in the movements when they went ahead with multiple muscle surgery rather than an enhanced bimedial recession. And small angle single muscle recessions also did better. This study was very interesting, where they studied the outcome in preterms versus term babies. And they found that preterm babies had much more overcorrection with the same formula as compared to a term baby. And they found that like per millimeter muscle, 4.4 prism diopters was gained in preterm baby compared to 3.99. So they suggested that
you
when
have
you
a minute to
preterm
go.
babies, when you operate on preterm babies, you can undercorrect or can change your formulas and recess lesser for better outcomes. So my take to office message here is, because there's no home anymore, we're all locked in our houses, and take to office messages: operate early. That early should be up to 18 months of age. At least get 2 measurements properly, treat refractive errors and amblyopia as even before, during, and after your surgery also, and tackle pattern deviations too, because this will prevent undercorrections. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Aloka, for the presentation.
Our next speaker is Dr. Shruti Nishant. She will be talking on impact of refractive error on strabismus. To introduce Dr. Shruti, she is a known ophthalmologist specializing with pediatric ophthalmology, strabismus, and genetics. Having passed her post-graduation from Arvind Eye Hospital, she presently is working with Kilpunk Medical College in Chennai and also a part of Global Eye Genetics Consortium.
Can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. There's a small error actually. I currently work in MNI hospitals. Kilpok is where I did my undergraduate from. Thank you so much for having me here today. So we're going to be talking about the role of refractive errors in strabismus. I thank Dr. Aloka for setting the stage up perfectly by clarifying what infantile esotropia is, so that we are done with that. Now, so let's begin. So we know that strabismus is basically when we're talking about strabismus and refractive error, we're talking majorly about hyperopia and myopia. Of course, we're going to be talking about anisometropia also. So hyperopia is more commonly related to, or is a risk factor for esotropia, whereas myopia is for exotropia. So having said that, let's go to hyperopia. So we do know that 90 to 95% of babies who are born are hyperopic by nature, and then most of them, almost a majority of them, have adequate accommodative efforts through their age, appropriate accommodative efforts, and end up with emetropia, and some even progress to myopia. But there is a small subset of kids who either have high plus or they have hypoaccommodation or hyperaccommodation, which in turn leaves them with a squint. And if they do have hypoaccommodation, they end up with having a constant esotropia and amblyopia. And if they do end up having hyperaccommodation, they end up having accommodative esotropia. So that's how it progresses. Now, this is a 4-year-old girl with left eye squinting. It's been there and now it's getting worse. And she had a +4 power, and with the cycloplegic refraction, she had her glasses on and the squint resolved. So this is a case of pure refractive accommodative esotropia. Now, why does refractive accommodative esotropia happen? That's because hyperopia as a nature in itself causes increased accommodative effort, and that increased accommodative effort leads to increased convergence, which in turn leads to esotropia. So this is how the hyperopic esotropia happens. It's usually seen between 1.5 to 4 years of age. It's usually about 1 to 2% of the general population. And you can see there is a relevant family history that you can pick out sometimes. They do have a subnormal Randor test, and the association of hyperopic and anisometropia is also commonly seen. Now, hyperopia and esotropia are generally related in a dose-dependent manner. And this is very interesting because this is a meta-analysis where they studied
the increase in the risk, and they found that between 2 to 3 diopters, there's a 10-fold increase. Between 3 to 5 diopters, there's a 40-fold increase in the risk of esotropia. And more than 5 diopters, it's a big jump of 218-fold increase in the risk of acquiring esotropia. So apart from the refractive accommodative esotropia, which is basically when you put in a perfect pair of glasses with the full cycloplegic correction, the esotropia disappears or gets less than 8 prisms. So that's pure refractive accommodative esotropia. There are 2 more components. One is the partial accommodative esotropia, or the decompensated variety, where you have, after cycloplegic correction, you put in the glasses, there is still a residual refractive error of more than 10 prism diopters for distance. There is a subset of this which is called the high AC by ratio, where we have a difference of 10 prism diopters for near after full cycloplegic correction. So here you can see the partially accommodative esotropia. This is a child who has a left esotropia with glasses partially corrected, and after surgical correction, you get the full orthotropia. Here again, when we measure for correcting the residual squint, it is very imperative to measure and operate for the value that you get on top of the glasses and not without. And the second is the accommodative esotropia with high AC by ratio, where you can see the glasses, the executive type bifocals, which bisect the pupils. And this is a child who's been weaned off the glasses and is now orthophoric. Okay, so this is just to clarify that such squints do not fall under the refractive category. This is an infant who has a large angle exotropia, and you can see that this child is less than 1 year, and they tend to have cross fixation, and they tend to have these combinations of primary inferior oblique overactions and DVDs and so on. So in these cases, operating them way earlier is very prudent, and they don't fall under the refractive category. And of course, their hyperopia is also very less, like less than 2, and that's how you identify them. When it comes to accommodative component surgery, you always treat the amblyopia first, and we prefer bimedial rectus recessions. And when you have an associated AC by A ratio, you perform a posterior fixation suture like a Fardens or a Scott's procedure. So to answer, can anisometropia cause a strabismus? Yes, they can. So anisometropia is usually associated with both esotropia and exotropia in children less than 5 years of age. But they're usually more commonly seen associated with hyperopia than myopia and astigmatism. So let's move on to component of myopia. Here you have a child with a right exotropia who has been having it on and off over a period of time. And he just came in with this complaint of squint. But when we did measure him, he had a refractive error of around -3. And with glasses, you can see that his control over the squint is much better. And this is a component of intermittent exotropia. So here there is a direct link between the fusional control, the control over the squint with the help of glasses. Now, there has been a 70% association of myopia with intermittent exotropia, and the risk factors are female gender, younger age, and excessive near work. And ideally, it's good to correct them appropriately. But why does this happen? What is this relationship? Is it a classic case of the chicken and the egg? Did myopia come first, or did the squint come first? So now there are 2 schools of thought. The traditional school of thought is that myopia causes a decreased accommodative demand because they don't need to accommodate, which in turn decreases the convergence demand, and that increases the risk of exotropia. Well, the other school of thought says the intermittent exotropia came first, which increases the convergence demand, increasing the accommodative demand, causing a progression of myopia. The first school of thought is a more traditional school of thought here. So apart from giving a regular minus lenses, we can also prescribe over minus glasses for these kids in order to bring about better control of their squinting or their exotropia. So it's usually tried in small angle exos between 1 to 4 diopter, but I usually don't go beyond 1.5. And they stimulate the accommodative convergence, and especially in terms of convergence insufficiency type, they're really helpful. And before and after surgery, even after surgery to control the microtropia, we can try them. Surgical considerations in intermittent exotropia, there are a few pointers here. Always measure the squint with the glasses on. I think it's a given here. Apart from that, we should also take in the component of glasses thickness here, because the thicker the glasses, the more basin effect the prismatic effect is going to give. So we need to add corrective factors. So how does the glasses affect? Minus lenses increase the exo deviation, and plus lenses decrease. So there is an inverse relationship, which means that we will have to undercorrect whenever you measure over a minus lens and overcorrect over a plus lens. Now, when is this significant? Anywhere where there is more than 5 diopters of glasses, there you will have to either use a contact lens or use such correction tables in order to accommodate for the difference in the prismatic value. So I'm going to end up with this. Can myopia really cause esotropia? So yes, there is a component called the esotropia-hypertropia complex or the heavy eye syndrome. What happens is when there's high axial length and high myopic eyes, you get these huge eyes which are 30 mm and they don't have space in the orbit to grow. So what happens is the only space that's available is the superior temporal quadrant, and then when they expand along that side, the superior rectus becomes nasal and the lateral rectus becomes inferior. In such cases, what happens is, this can be seen on the MRI of brain and orbit. In such cases, the eye goes into hypotropia and esotropia. So what we basically do in surgery is to identify the lateral rectus and the superior rectus and identify 14 mm behind and pull, using a non-absorbable suture, we kind of pull these two ends together and push the globe back, the herniated globe back into the orbit and then close them up. So here you can see we're just hooking the muscle, but towards the end, now this is the superior rectus and that is the lateral rectus. We have now identified and sutured the portions there, and then now we tie them both together. So this is how it was pre-op, and then with the esotropia has recovered with improvement in abduction. So this is my take-home message. Myopia is associated with exotropia, and minus or over minus glasses help. Hyperopia is associated in a dose-dependent manner with esotropia, where glasses help. Definitely an isometropia and astigmatism can be a causative for strabismus. Reduce the measured deviation in high myopes with glasses, increase the measured deviation in high hyperopes with glasses. Thank you. Thank you for Dr. Prachi, and thank you BOA for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am, for the presentation. We now proceed on with Dr. Darshana.
So Dr. Darshana is going to talk to us about tips in pediatric ophthalmology evaluation. She has been successfully practicing general and pediatric ophthalmology from Aurangabad.
At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. And I will be starting with my talk on tips for pediatric ophthalmic evaluation. Examining a pediatric patient can be a daunting task. However, if extra time is taken initially to gain the trust of the child, the rest of the examination will go on more easily. So it all begins with establishing a rapport with the child, and a child-friendly ambience can put the kid at ease. One should always remember the dictum, one toy, one look, and have an adequate collection of toys in our clinic to facilitate the assessment. Also, reward stickers and sweets kept handy can do wonders. Important to review the case history before so that we know exactly what to assess, as children are amenable to examination during the first moments of encounter. Also, get the child talking and do the external examination, because as the child talks, more likely that he'll be cooperating for the examination. Do non-contact things first. Try to engage the child, making every step of the examination again. Use of light should be preferably towards the end of the examination, because some children are very sensitive to light and turn up being uncooperative. In older kids, it helps to explain the procedure to the children. While examining uncooperative young children or in newborns, this can be easily done by restraining, in which two assistants will help to stabilize or immobilize the child, and one can get our evaluation done. If a detailed evaluation is needed, lit speculum with topical anesthetic can be used. Demonstrating the procedure on the parent can help sometimes. Often toddlers will allow a quick look at the slit lamp if we keep the light as dim as possible and we have in mind what to see and look at that first. If the child is uncooperative for a standard slit lamp, the indirect ophthalmoscope with a 20D lens is a good magnifier which can be focused on the cornea. The red reflex test is also another very good test which can pick up small anterior segment opacities which can otherwise get missed without a slit lamp. It is done with a retinoscope or a direct ophthalmoscope. In small focal pediatric cataracts, it's important to assess the red reflex in the undilated state to assess the visual impact of the cataract. An asymmetrical red reflex is always a cause of concern. Lens rack is very useful for quick refraction in kids. However, some kids would object the lens rack over their face, in which case we would have to hold the lenses by hand and do the refraction. In such cases, we should be able to gauge the cylinder axis by eye. Important to remember keep a track of the working distance while doing the retinoscopy, and also keep an eye on the child's head position. Anisocoria evaluation can be done with a retinoscope from a distance. We place the retinoscope bar at 180 degrees and sit far enough to have the light hover over both pupils while looking through the retinoscope. This can be used for both light and dim settings. When screening of pediatric vision, one should know that kids are notorious for peeking, and patching of the fellow eye always helps. Asking the older kids to read backwards is also useful because kids tend to memorize the vision charts. In the absence of nystagmus, there should be no significant improvement in acuity testing when tested with both eyes open. While assessing monocular vision in nystagmus, placing an occluder close to the eye can worsen the nystagmus. Hence, it is important to use hold the occluder slightly away from the eye, or use of high plus lenses for fogging rather than an occluder, or using a semi-opaque occluder. While testing vision in the pre-literate, it is important to familiarize the child with the pictures, either by reciting or pointing with the key card while testing with the picture chart. The goal of the vision testing in the pre-literate age group is to ascertain equality of vision in both eyes in the shortest possible time, rather than a 6/9 or a 6/6 vision. True esotropia or pseudo-esotropia can be easily demonstrated to the parents by pinching the nasal bridge and demonstrating the centered corneal reflexes. The doll's head maneuver is another extraocular movements. In this child, we can see with alternating esotropia, the abduction is normal as elicited by the doll's head maneuver. It can differentiate between comitant and incomitant squints also. Anomalous head posture has various etiologies. Patching of an eye should improve an anomalous head posture if it is due to strabismus, but not if musculoskeletal or neurologic in origin. Confrontation visual fields can be done in small kids with the two-toy test, where a toy is placed in the primary position and another toy is introduced in the peripheral field, and the first change in the refixation towards this peripheral target is noted. This can be repeated in all the 4 quadrants, and we can diagnose neurological defects with this. In children who complain of watering, but without the classical signs of discharge or matting of lashes, the dye disappearance test can rule out the presence of an outflow obstruction. Indirect ophthalmoscopy is the last part of the examination. Important to use a low illumination as possible, no manipulating of the lids. Quick view of each eye can be obtained. It also helps if we can have the child focus on a mobile playing song or a cartoon. For a detailed or a peripheral evaluation in younger children, restraining can be done. Instilling of eye drops. Before instilling a dilating drops, using a topical anesthetic before the dilating drops can help. In an extremely non-compliant child who refuses to open his eyes, placing the child supine with the eyes closed, a single drop can be placed in the sulcus between the medial canthus and the ipsilateral side of the nose. Child should maintain supine. Ocular penetration is achieved with this method, although it is lesser than the conventional method. So to summarize, maintaining a directed flexible approach throughout the examination can ease a pediatric eye evaluation. An early diagnosis of a treatable condition is the reward for success. Thank you.
Thank you, Mom. Thank you for the lovely tips. They are surely going to be helpful for all of us.
I now call upon
Dr.
Kuheli Bhattacharya from Goa, and she's going to talk to us about use of social media to enhance pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus practice.
Kuheli, are you there?
Hello, Prachi? Can you hear me? Can you speak?
Your voice is cracking.
Is my slide?
Voice is cracking a little bit. We can hear you, but it's cracking a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, now you're
You can
audible.
also hear the cyclone.
Now you're audible.
Now you're
Audible?
audible, ma'am. Yes,
Okay,
you're audible.
Am I? Okay.
Yes.
We'll try and go ahead. Let's see if this is
No, I think she's not audible. I think you'll go.
I think
Go
we'll
ahead
go
with the
ahead
next
with the
one.
next presentation, ma'am.
Dr. Reshma. Dr. Reshma.
Dr. Reshma Mehta.
Can I start my presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Reshma, start your screen share.
Yes.
Dr. Reshma, you'll have to share your screen again.
Yes, yes, just a second.
Okay, ma'am.
this Dr. Reshma's.
My screen.
Yes, ma'am. It's showing as loading to us.
Just a second. Okay, can you see?
Yeah, it's visible.
Yes, it is visible.
We have been hearing a lot about strabismus. I am a little off track. I will be talking about retinopathy of prematurity. Thanks to BOA organizers and Dr. Prachi for giving me this opportunity to present few cases in ROP. All of us know retinopathy of prematurity. It is because of the premature babies who have been given a lot of oxygen and their STOMI NICU stay. All these babies are actually not blind, and hence we need to screen them, and it is a preventable cause of blindness if not screened on time. Screening is compulsory in all the babies with less than 34 weeks of gestation and 2 kgs. And those babies who are less than 28 weeks of gestation and less than 1200 grams, we should screen them much earlier. Usually we go with the tagline of Tees Din Roshni Ke, given by Dr. Subhadra Jalali ma'am from LV Prasad. This tagline is important. So once the baby is 1 month old, they know that they have to undergo screening. There is international classification of retinopathy of prematurity, which has 5 parameters: the zone, clock hours, stage, plus disease, and pre+. For all the patients of retinopathy of prematurity, laser holds as the mainstay of treatment, and the responsibility of diagnosing and recognizing the infants with ROP lies with the pediatrician or the neonatologist. So we have to be very friendly with them, and they should let us in their NICUs to screen these babies and avoid from being blind. After screening them, communication with the parents and considering them the STOMI NICU stay, and then asking them for the screening program and frequent follow-ups and the treatment is very important, and the onus lies on the ophthalmologist. The international classification of retinopathy of prematurity, it tells us about the zone 1, 2, and 3, where the disease is. Usually most of the babies in the NICU have zone 3 and stage 1, and very few babies we get them in zone 2 or zone 3. So I will be presenting few of the cases here. The zone stage 1 is where you can see a demarcation line between the vascularized and the avascular retina. Stage 2 is the demarcation line is with elevation, and stage 3 is demarcation line with fibrovascular proliferation. We'll have few slides with plus disease and the pre-plus and the APROP, the aggressive posterior retinopathy of prematurity, where it does not follow any of the stages, but suddenly the baby lands into retinal detachment. The pathophysiology of retinopathy of prematurity is the baby is prematurely born, and hence there is incomplete retinal vascularization. They're exposed to increased oxygen concentration, which leads to vasoconstriction, vasoobliteration, and further leading to VEGF factors, which are increased, leading to tortuosity of the vessels, plus disease, neovascularization, fibrovascular proliferation, and along with it, NBI, pupillary rigidity. So this is the first case which shows tortuous vessels, venous dilatation, and arterial tortuosity. The baby, this baby was 31-week gestation and born with the birth weight of only 900 grams. This is after sequential follow-up visits, the vascular area has increased, and there is abnormal branching of the peripheral vessels with few fibrous conglomerations or the popcorn lesions, which are very frequently seen. And then there is formation of the double ridge, and which is extending in almost all 360 degrees. So later this baby was taken up for laser. This is stage 3 ROP, retinopathy of prematurity. The same baby, we can see the abnormal vascular proliferation and the new vessels branching, and the increased in the size and the width of the ridge, and the hemorrhages which are increasing in the ridge area. And there is large avascular area which is not vascularized and needs quick treatment. The next baby, this baby is born at 30 weeks with 1200 grams with 2 doses of surfactant given, history of RDS, sepsis. The baby was on ventilator for 4 days, CPAP for 3 days, and nasal catheter for 4 days again. So this was diagnosed as APROP, that is aggressive posterior retinopathy of prematurity. You can see a lot of hemorrhages and the abnormal vasculature, especially the immature vessels, and they are totally abnormal vessels, not fitting into any criteria of any of the stages. So later again, this baby was also lasered, because otherwise this will go into retinal detachment. Baby 3, this baby was born in 32 weeks with 1500 grams, and this shows normal vasculature, but there is a vascular area and abnormal peripheral vascularization, and few collaterals can be seen here. So this was just put as stage 1, and frequent follow-ups were done. But later this did develop into a demarcation line, a wide demarcation line, but after few follow-ups it did resolve. So in this pandemic, it is very important that the patient comes for follow-up, and there is good confidence level between the parents and the doctor or the ophthalmologist that definitely he is going to come, or otherwise the baby may land into further complications and retinal detachment. So medicine helps in follow-ups, because then the machine can screen the babies in the periphery and the rural parts, interiors of Solapur or Maharashtra district.
A minute more to go, ma'am.
Yeah. This is the 4th baby, which shows the stage 2, and we followed up this baby with sequential follow-ups, which shows that there is decrease in the vascular area. This is another baby with the stage 2 ROP, and this one is stage 4A. This baby we had seen in the NICU, but they were very reluctant for treatment, and you can see stage 4A, huge fibrovascular band with lot of hemorrhages and tortuosity. And finally, the baby is lasered now and has to go for surgery for the tractional bands. And this is another case of APROP with strong or abnormal vessels and venular dilatation and arterial tortuosity in zone 1, and lot of hemorrhages all throughout. For continuous 3 follow-ups, pupillary rigidity can be seen, lot of hemorrhages, and later this baby, we gave them Avastin and then had to follow up with laser. This is another case which I've just seen 2-3 days back. Right eye is totally normal, but left eye shows a huge hemorrhage with abnormal vasculature and abnormal disc vessels. You can see some few fibrous bands also around the disc, and there is a huge hemorrhage. So actually this is a questionable thing because this is not retinopathy of prematurity. B scan is done, but still they say it is RD, retinal detachment with choroidal detachment and subhyaloid hemorrhage, but still under investigation and treatment. There's a small video.
Ma'am, can we summarize here, please?
Yeah. Okay.
Short of time.
A gift that keeps
Dr.
me going.
Reshma, you'll have to stop
After
your
screening
video.
almost more than 2,000 babies
Dr.
for
Reshma?
ROP since 8 years, I always fear about medico-legal complications
Dr. Reshma, you will have to
associated with
stop
this.
your video.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Reshma.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hemalini. Thank you, Dr. Prachi, and thank you, BA organizers, for giving me an opportunity to present in this webinar. Thank you so much.
Ashni, do we have Dr. Pooja and Dr. Kuheli now?
We have Dr. Kuheli, not Dr. Pooja.
So let Dr. Kuheli try again.
Let me just try once more.
Sure, ma'am.
Stop sharing.
I'm unable to share the screen.
You can try now, ma'am.
Screen sharing is right. Am I audible? Is the screen seen?
No, the screen is not seen.
Okay. For me, it says I'm sharing the screen. Is the screen?
No, I'm unable to see it. I think Dr. Kuheli has. I think
Dr. Abha and Dr. Shea, are you all there? Dr. Abha, madam?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Till Kuheli gets ready, do you want to make some comments on the various talks, or you want to ask any questions or anything?
See, all the talks are very nice. They know their subject very well and they're doing very well. And I'm really, like Sunaina Malik madam said, that they are so much interested in SQUENT. So I am also very happy. I just wanted to add 1 or 2 tips that when we examine the child who is below 2-3 years of age, I usually don't do refraction in the OPD. I give them the cycloplegic and they come. Or sometimes even if we do it in the OPD, I ask the parents to put the drops in the child's eye. And another thing is, while doing fundus examination, we have to take a proper position, which Dr. Darshana had showed. But before that, because the child cries a lot, so I always ask the history of breath holding while the child cries. So it's better because sometimes they have a habit of breath holding. So that I rule out. And really, they're doing very well. And sensory.
Ashni, you have any questions?
I think Dr. Kuheli has started.
Okay.
Okay. I think we'll take up the questions after she finishes her talk.
See, the problem is that she's not able to start, and you all have exactly now 10 minutes more because.
So you continue with the questions, I think, till the time she really logs in and is able to speak.
So I had a question for Dr. Monica, ma'am. How frequent do you ask for the follow-up for the children who have the intraocular lens which is dropped inside, the natural lens? So how frequent do you ask for the follow-up? Is it a 3-monthly follow-up or a 6-monthly, yearly? How does it?
Yeah, so depending on the age actually. So if you see this child, I had like after both the lenses have fallen down, initially at 6 months and then once a year.
Okay. Okay, ma'am.
But if it is like this baby, I had one eye drop and one eye still, I definitely call them after 3 months once, every 3 months to see what is this situation.
Okay.
Ashwini, I think Kuheli is ready.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Kuheli, please start. Prachi, what should we do?
I don't think she will have enough connection. I think because of the
Okay, then leave it.
cyclone.
We'll continue with the questions and
maybe
yeah.
Kuheli, you can just make comments.
No, Kuheli,
your voice is not good actually. So if you want, you can just make some comments in short if you can and if we can hear you. Because I don't think you'll be able to make the presentation with the kind of connection you're having.
Is this better?
This is better.
Yes, it is.
It's not audible.
Okay, try talking now. Try just continuing.
Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah, Kuheli, you can continue your presentation.
Okay.
And if we can't hear you, then we will just stop.
So good evening, everyone. I'm so sorry that we had to,
No, Prachi, I think we'll call it quits, man.
Yes. Because of the cyclone, there's a lot of internet issues.
Yeah.
Instead, we'll take 3-4 questions and then we can.
Yes.
Dr. Shruti? Is Shruti Nishant there?
Yes, I'm here.
Shruti, there's a question for you that, a lot of, you spoke on strabismus and refractive errors.
Yeah.
And, you get a lot of patients in private practice with high myopia and strabismus. So for the benefit of the audience, what would you advise them if they ask you for LASIK? Would you advise LASIK first followed by strabismus or the other way around?
Okay, so again, so when we have adults who are beyond 18 or 21 or wherever they have a stable refractive error, we do go in for this, such patients who want LASIK and they don't know. And sometimes they even put the question back to us saying, whatever you suggest. So in those cases, I give them, I do measure them with the glasses and without the glasses. And I see what difference in refractive error, what difference in the squint value we get. And based on that, I take a call. If there is not much of a difference with and without glasses, then I advise them to go for the squint first, followed by the LASIK. If there is a difference, then I do ask them to go for the LASIK first, followed by the squint. So it's a very tailored approach. I don't have
And how much time gap do you keep?
So I give 6 months for complete healing. That's how much time I space them out. But I do know that there are people who do it at 2 or 3 months also. But I give 6 months.
Right.
Any cases which have decompensated?
Very unlikely. That's the thing. Actually, they're very unlikely that the LASIK does really influence. In fact, there's not much of a thing. Though we have learned a lot about that, but we do see that it doesn't really influence. So either way, it works. But just for the safety of the procedure in itself, it would be good to do the squint first, then the LASIK, going against the traditional teaching.
So I would like to just add on to what Shruti has said. The fusional amplitudes actually are the way I think to really decide what we should go in with first. So if the patients have very good fusional amplitudes, post LASIK they improve by themselves and then generally they don't require a squint surgery. However, if the fusional amplitudes are very poor, then probably it's a better idea to correct the squint first before going in for the LASIK. And also for the high myopes especially, it's a good idea to measure them with the contact lenses on. So that gives us an idea as to what their status would be after LASIK. A closer, that would be a better evaluation. So the fusional amplitudes really make a difference in really deciding what we should be going in first with.
We have time for one more question. Riddhi, you want to ask a question to anybody from the audience? Sorry, from the speakers. Prachi, do you have any question for the speakers?
Yeah, I would like to ask Monica one question. So, especially with respect to diagnosing sarcoidosis in the pediatric age group, Monica, are you there?
I am there.
Yeah. So you talked about the raised serum ACE values. So as we know, generally the ACE values are known to be on the higher side in the pediatric age group. So do you really add on to getting the serum calcium levels as well as an HRCT?
Yes. So serum calcium levels as well as HRCT would be advised. And then depending on that, you will actually bifurcate between tuberculosis and sarcoidosis, depending on the lymph nodes, caseation, and also that is the next thing. I actually didn't show that slide because but that is how you go about with ACE and then serum calcium, urine creatinine, and go about doing the HRCT. Yeah.
Is there time for one more question?
Yes, one last question.
I would like to ask Dr. Shruti and other panelists also, like many a times we get these adult patients who've never used glasses, but they're hypermetropes and have esotropia. And how do you, so they want a cosmetic surgical outcome. And do you end up undercorrecting them, or what is your target for the esotropia? Because these are the ones who don't want to wear the glasses. And they have a significant +4/+5 cycloplegic retinoscopy. So how do you go about it?
You mean to say they would like to wear their glasses, but they don't
want to wear glasses. They want a cosmetic squint correction. They are somebody who have never been corrected for squint or glasses earlier.
Okay, so the question is, how would you correct the squint in such cases?
Yes.
So in these high pluses, so the plus actually underestimates. So when we measure, we kind of have to slightly undercorrect them. That's what I would do. And are you asking in terms of the laser as well, or just the squint?
So what happens in these patients? These are ones who have never worn glasses. They have been uncorrected hypermetropes. They might be accommodative esotropia in childhood, but they never got glasses then, and they remain esotropes throughout. Now they don't accept your plus because they have a very their cycloplegic retinoscopies are high, but otherwise they're around 6 parts uncorrected. So these are the ones where you can't give a glass. You need to do a squint surgery. So is there a different plan that you take for these patients? Anybody from the panelists can also go and...
No, I think ideally the dictum is that, even if they've never worn glasses, you have to first give them glasses. I sometimes don't hesitate giving atropine adaptation followed by glasses, trying to explain to the patient that it's in their own interest. And then after coming, after they come back for a follow-up, reassess the squint, measure the angles again. And maybe in these older patients, who've been detected hyperopia for the first time, maybe you won't want to give the entire plus correction. You might want to undercorrect them a little bit.
So as soon as you give that atropine, they're going to jump the lane and go to the next ophthalmologist, because that's what many a times
but that's the right thing to do.
Let them go, no problem. Let them go, no problem.
Yes. Ma'am, and how long do we wait after giving the hypermet? Suppose if we've undercorrected and it is showing a moderate change in the esotropia, then what to do next? Do we wait, give another trial of
then I would wait for some time, and then once the atropine effect is worn off, measure the angles again, and then operate for the residual angle. But I have to still tell the patient that even post-surgery, some amount of hyperopic spectacle correction will be required, either in the form of glasses or in the form of contact lenses.
Okay.
Basically, the accommodative effort cannot be corrected by surgery.
So we will So that's what I was about to say. We initially had one patient like this. Invariably, they do end up having some amount of amblyopia as well. So we do have to address that issue. So we did one patient with similar, like I think +4 anisohyperope. And what we did for that patient is we gave the glasses, we gave contacts. In fact, I did adult amblyopia therapy for him. He got better up to 6/9, and then we did the squint. In fact, he underwent LASIK actually. Hyperopic LASIK, got that corrected, and then we corrected the squint later. So we follow the same process as how we follow for a child is what we have the same patients and work on each aspect of it as we work on a child. Hemalini ma'am, anything would you add?
No, I would quite agree with you. I mean, yes, hyperopic LASIK is also an option, and then exactly like what you said. I think we'll wind up. Does somebody want to give a vote of thanks and conclude the session, please?
I do the needful. So thank you, Amma madam, Dr. Shreya madam, and the entire VOA team, Hemalini madam, and all the wonderful speakers, Monica, Shruti, Anuka, everybody, one and all. So it was a lovely session, and hope to see you physically sometime soon. in an actual conference.